Good morning. In the published version of a lecture which I gave at Oxford in 2010, I expressed the view that Jules Oppert's contributions to the elucidation of Akkadian and Sumerian merit a detailed study, and that only then shall we have a full picture of his role in that phase of decipherment that began about 1853. The final words in my Oxford paper are, Oppert certainly deserves a place next to the genius Hincks and the ambitious, hard-working Rawlinson. I am, therefore, delighted to join you all in Paris to celebrate the bicentenary of Jules Oppert, and I wish to express my thanks to Dominique Charpin and Antoine Jacquet and their colleagues who have organized this symposium for inviting me to participate. There is nothing in Edward Hincks's papers and correspondence before 1846 to suggest that he was studying cuneiform inscriptions. However, it is hardly surprising to find that Hincks was trying to decipher the languages written in several kinds of cuneiform writing. He would have relished the challenge. As the Oxford Assyriologist Archibald Henry Sayce said many years later, no problem in decipherment ever seemed to baffle Hincks. Hincks had already made a name in the field of Egyptology. As early as 1833, he had published an article on demotic, and by 1846, just as he was about to publish his first papers on cuneiform, he became, in the words of the Tübingen Egyptologist Wolfgang Schenkel, the first to show that the sounds of Egyptian that were read as vowels and are still commonly taught to be pronounced as vowels today are in fact consonants. On the 6th of June 1846, the first of a series of important papers by Hincks was read at a meeting of the Royal Irish Academy. In his first paper, Hincks completed the final stage of the decipherment of Old Persian by showing that the writing system was semi-syllabic and rather than strictly consonantal. We now know that he had been studying Old Persian for a number of years. He acknowledged in particular the usefulness of the extensive survey of Old Persian scholarship by E.F.F. Beyer, published in the Allgemeine Literaturzeitung in 1838. In addition to his remarks on Old Persian, Hincks also laid out his differences from Niels Ludwig Westergaard on Elamite. At the end of his paper, he added an important postscript in which he announced that he had made some progress in reading the third kind of writing, Babylonian, found on trilingual inscriptions, on various Babylonian clay bricks and tablets, and on the East India House inscription. He states that the language appears to have much in common with the Semitic languages. Although this postscript on Babylonian, written at the beginning of June 1846, was not published until December, there is similar and fuller information in the letters which Hincks wrote to learned societies and to the editor of the Literary Gazette, a London literary magazine, in June and July 1846. In the letters, he announces that he has read Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, on various brick inscriptions and has found the same names in the East India House inscription. He further writes, I have worked out the values of many signs, and I can now show that I have not been merely conjecturing, as my predecessors have done, but have proceeded on the surest grounds. Hincks has quickly recognized how cuneiform signs were used. Consonant-vowel and vowel-consonant signs could be combined to represent a consonant-vowel-consonant syllable. I should mention that his first article on Old Persian and Elamite, in which he disagrees with Christian Larsen, was translated into German later and published in the Zeitschrift für die Kunde des Morgenlandes at Lassen's request. In a letter to the Literary Gazette in July 1846, Hincks reveals his significant discovery that portions of the text on the East India House inscription from Babylon are found on the clay cylinder known as the Kerr-Porter inscription. He uses the term lapidary to describe the signs on the East India House inscription, which is made of stone, and cursive to describe those on clay inscriptions. Through the establishment of the equivalences between the lapidary and cursive signs, which sometimes bear little or no resemblance, a larger number of texts could be studied. Henry Chiswick Rawlinson was clearly impressed by this discovery, though he was never going to admit it in public. He wrote to one of his correspondents, Cecil Renoir, "This, by the by, reminds me of the noble field now opening in the Babylonian line. How Dr. Hincks succeeded in sinking his first shaft, I hardly understand, but sunk it he certainly has. I am indebted to him for a notable discovery, one, in fact, which has proved of more use to me even than my Behistun key." I should mention here that in September 1846, the first of Rawlinson's impressive work, the Persian cuneiform inscriptions at Behistun, was published. Hincks wrote a long review of it, in which he praised Rawlinson's work, especially his translation and interpretation, though he thought his contribution to decipherment of the Old Persian language was small. Rawlinson must have been quite surprised and probably unnerved to discover that there was a Protestant clergyman in Ireland he had never heard of who knew Old Persian well enough to review his work with such authority. Not long after Hincks's review appeared, Jules Oppert, at this time still living in Germany, published his work Das Lautsystem des Altpersischen. All of a sudden, Rawlinson was hearing about two learned scholars who knew Old Persian in addition to Arabic, Hebrew, Sanskrit, and other languages, and had now turned his attention to Assyrian and Babylonian. To support his view that the language was Semitic, Hincks pointed out that he had noticed the feminine termination, a variety of pronominal affixes, and three performatives of the verb. August Ludwig Schleierzer, in an article on the Chaldeans, published in 1781, had already said that the term Semitic should be applied to the languages of the Syrians, Babylonians, Hebrews, and Arabs. Hincks could now show that this was the case for the language of the Assyrians and Babylonians. His identification of the first-person pronoun anarku, which occurs, for example, in the East India House inscription, column 1, line 22, was further confirmation that the language was Semitic. It was obviously related to Hebrew anarchy. Meanwhile, Rawlinson was struggling, and he expressed doubts that scholars would ever obtain the same insight into the Babylonian language that they had in the case of the Old Persian language. While Hincks was confidently announcing progress during the summer of 1846, Rawlinson was telling Austin Henry Layard that the language had to be reconstructed ab origine. "It is, in my opinion," he said, "utterly unrelated. Correspondents do not exist in any available speech, Semitic, Aryan, or Scythic." And he wondered how scholars were ever going to be able to interpret the language and the text with any certainty. In the articles which he published in 1847, Hincks provided lists of Akkadian cuneiform signs with their values, and also examples of the lapidary and cursive forms of the signs. To make greater progress in deciphering the writing system and understanding the language, Hincks needed more texts. He was aware that in the French periodical Journal Asiatique for 1840, there were about 40 cuneiform inscriptions which had been copied by the German explorer Friedrich Eduard Stulz near Lake Van in the 1820s. Hincks knew the values of some of the signs in the inscriptions already, and the new ones he identified expanded his list of signs. To his surprise, he discovered that most of the inscriptions were not written in Assyrian, but in a non-Semitic language, which at that time was sometimes called Vannic. Today we call it Eurasian. In these Eurasian inscriptions, essentially the same script is used to write a different language. Peter Daniels is the first scholar to show the importance of Hincks's publications on the Vanni inscriptions for the decipherment of Mesopotamian cuneiform. In 1849, Hincks wrote one of his most important papers with the title On the Khorsabad Inscriptions. In it, he shows that signs have more than one reading, and he explains the nature of logograms, including composite logograms. In those days, of course, scholars used the term ideogram. Hincks has also worked out the principle of homophony, explaining to his readers that in some cases, two or more outwardly distinct signs expressed the same syllable. He was coming to grips with the writing system, but he wanted to know why signs had more than one phonetic reading and had logographic as well as phonetic readings. In a footnote, he made the invaluable and far-reaching observation, it is possible that the word from which the phonetic value is derived may be one belonging to a different language. At a conference in Edinburgh in July 1850, Hincks delivered a lecture on the language and mode of writing of the ancient Assyrians. In the published summary, it is stated that Hincks maintained in opposition to all other writers that the characters had all definite syllabic values, though the language of the Assyrians was Semitic, their mode of writing was not. Elsewhere, he said, the signs were originally intended to represent a non-Semitic language. And later, he said, no Semitic people could have invented a system of writing so uncongenial to their language. In his lecture at Edinburgh, Hincks was reaffirming to his audience, which included Rawlinson, the views which he had laid out in his previous papers. At first, the non-Semitic language was called Akkadian, which is very confusing for us today. Later, Hincks and Rawlinson preferred the name Chaldean or Old Chaldean. It was only after Hincks's death in 1866 that Jules Oppert gave it its correct name, Sumerian. At the Edinburgh Conference, Rawlinson dismissed Hincks's views. He continued to cling to his view that the writing system consisted of syllabic signs and literal bare consonantal signs, as well as logograms. In 1851, Rawlinson gave a very long lecture at a large gathering in London, which was chaired by Prince Albert. He was convinced that the writing system was of Egyptian origin, and he still insisted that it consisted of both syllabic signs and literal signs. His publication of the Babylonian text of the Behistun inscription in 1852, described by Christopher Walker of the British Museum as the first major landmark, an opinion with which I disagree, has examples of the curious transliteration of signs by bare consonants only. Rawlinson was not to be deterred by Hincks's views, and he gave the example of cat, composed of two signs, ka and at. He wrote, either of these must represent a simple letter, rather than a syllable. And as this peculiarity of expression pervades the Assyrian alphabet, I think I am justified in still adhering to the statement last year that phonetic signs were in some cases syllabic and in other cases literal. In Rawlinson's view, the first sign was not syllabic ka, but a simple consonant k. But simply, and the second sign was at. This is the opposite of Hincks's position. Hincks had already pointed out in 1846 paper that the syllable tash in Elamite could be written with two syllables, ta and ash, but definitely not ta and the simple consonant sh. The Danish scholar Mogens Trolle Larsen thinks Rawlinson finally made a breakthrough in reading cuneiform inscriptions in 1851, but a close reading of Rawlinson's publications for this period suggests otherwise. In 1852, Layard was writing his book, Discoveries in the Ruins of Nineveh and Babylon, and he decided that Hincks was the person to help him with the inscriptional materials, which he had brought back from his excavations in the Near East. As a result of this very satisfactory cooperation, Layard persuaded the trustees of the British Museum to engage Hincks for a year to prepare transliterations and annotated translations of specified inscriptions. In May 1854, Hincks delivered to the trustees of the British Museums translations of the long inscription of Ashurnasirpal II, some inscriptions of Sennacherib, and a revised translation of the Annals of Shalmaneser III. 2 months earlier, he had submitted a report with the title Report to the Trustees of the British Museum respecting certain cylinders and terracotta tablets with cuneiform inscriptions. Among the clay tablets which Hincks found especially interesting was one that gives different forms of the verbs, shakanu and shiraku. The tablet belongs to the series Ana Itishu. Hincks followed this up with a further report in July 1854. He had noticed that a fragment of a tablet, which he had recognized as part of a syllabary, when Layard showed it to him on a visit to Hincks's house in Ireland in 1852, had been given the number K62. This tablet contains the text known today as syllabary A. Hincks came across another syllabary, K110, now known as syllabary B. In 1855, Oppert also visited the British Museum to examine the cuneiform inscriptions. Hincks and Oppert had a limited knowledge of each other's work, but they began to correspond in June 1855. Oppert had been reading Hincks's recent publication on Assyrian mythology and was very pleased to find an honourable mention in it. Hincks and Oppert met in the British Museum during the summer of 1855, and they discussed, among other things, the phonetic complement. Some years later, they had a disagreement about priority of the discovery of it. This is not unusual in the history of cuneiform studies. Just as Hincks had made some significant finds among the British Museum collections in 1853 and 1854, so too did Oppert during his 1855 visit. Samuel Birch told Hincks that many of the tablets which Oppert examined had been cleaned of the encrustations since Hincks's previous visits. As you know, Oppert was visiting the British Museum at the behest of the authorities in Paris, and in 1856 he published his Rapport adressé à son Excellence, Monsieur le Ministre de l'Instruction publique et des Cultes. Hincks and Oppert performed an instructive service for other scholars in their respective examinations of the cuneiform inscriptions in the British Museum. It seems to me that Oppert, like Hincks, must have experienced great satisfaction in examining and deciphering the interesting and informative variety of texts. The breadth of Oppert's interest found in his many publications during the following decades, historical, legal, astronomical, etc., surely had its origins in his diligent examination of the collections of cuneiform inscriptions. A major desideratum in cuneiform studies during this period was a rigorous description of the language. Among the more noteworthy contributions made by Hincks and Oppert, their studies of the Assyrian verb deserve special mention. Between July 1855 and July 1856, Hincks published 4 articles on the Assyrian verb. Oppert's exposition of the verb is found in his Grammaire Assyrienne. Unfortunately, their publications are not easy to read. If Hincks's frequently changing transliteration systems are a hindrance to reading his publications, Oppert's addition of a baffling Hebrew transliteration of Akkadian forms in his grammar is equally difficult and impractical. In the chapters on the verb, Oppert even adds the Old Persian equivalents for good measure. We have to admire the patience of the printers and the publishers. Nevertheless, these studies of grammar were very important. Dominique Charpin has suggested that the publication of Oppert's grammar has been considered as le début de la syriologie en tant que discipline pleine et entière. From time to time, Rawlinson also discussed forms of the verb and other aspects of Assyrian and Babylonian grammar, but he never took the trouble to present even a coherent outline. This may explain why Norris persuaded Hincks to write his specimen chapters of Assyrian grammar, which, Norris said, would provide him, that is Norris, with much invaluable instruction. With financial aid obtained by Norris to contribute to the cost of the printing, the chapters on verbs, nouns, and possessive affixes were published during the last months of Hincks's life in 1866. Hincks's work is spoiled by unwarranted claims against Oppert. Perhaps bad health and advancing age were taking their toll. Oppert was a pioneer in the study of a variety of Akkadian texts. His academic training stood him in good stead for editing texts with philological and archaeological commentary. Describing himself as just a humble worker in the field of Assyriology, Oppert said, "Je n'ai qu'une ambition, c'est d'apporter quelques pierres à l'édifice que construit la science de notre époque." He would not have objected if we amended his text to say that he brought beaucoup de pierres à l'édifice. Merci.